Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teaching with Magic, a podcast exploring the intersection of education, fantasy, and literacy. Here at Teaching with Magic, we explore the different ways that teachers in the fiction and in the real world make magic for their students. You'll hear discussions about teachers and teaching methods in fantasy, science fiction, and pop culture. You'll hear interviews with scholars in various fields about important topics in education, and you'll get to be a part of an ongoing conversation about why the imagination matters. Welcome to Teaching with Magic. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Teaching with Magic. Today is a solo episode, and I wanted to record this one because I have a particular subject in mind that I would like to send off to publication. And before I do, I wanted to share it with all of you so that I could get some feedback. I presented this particular topic to two different conferences. Last year was the Pop Culture Conference at DePaul University. And then this past November, we had Carolina Moot with Signum University, and that was specifically on teaching in fantasy and teaching science fiction. And I thought, well, what better opportunity for me to present my thoughts on Ahsoka Tano. You may have seen this post written on my WordPress, and I'm planning on publishing this episode both in text and in podcast format to my Substack, because this is an opportunity for me to share it with all of you before I send it off to publication, and of course to receive critical feedback from all of you. I know how it looks in a presentation format, and I know how it sounds in a presentation format, and there are just some ways that it seems to have mistranslated as I've gone from text to presentation to paper and back and forth. So I want to share it with all of you and have it in both audio, video, and text format, hoping that it also provides the opportunity for accessibility and multimodal input. So without further ado, I would like to share my thoughts on Ahsoka Tano, the master and apprentice relationship in both Ahsoka and in the Clone Wars, and trauma-responsive education. So in my research, I use narrative inquiry practices and my knowledge of teaching and pedagogy to analyze teachers and mentor figures in fantasy and science fiction. Star Wars is well suited to answer some of the questions I have about teaching and learning, as it is a story that is not only about the student, the Padawan, and their path to understanding the Force, but it is also about the master and what the master has learned to pass on to the student. This presentation examines Ahsoka's character arc and education as an apprentice to her role as master to Sabine Wren. I'll compare evidence from episodes in Star Wars, The Clone Wars, and Ahsoka to educational research to show how the Clone Wars impacted Ahsoka's ability to learn and how critical it is that our institutions, namely our government, public school systems, and mental health organizations, work together to ensure that no child ever has to live with trauma again. So, how did the constant stress of war and the need to make quick decisions impact Ahsoka's education? How did the trauma of the war impact Ahsoka's apprenticeship with Anakin Skywalker, and consequently her role as master in teaching Sabine Wren? And how can narrative inquiry in fictional stories inform teaching practices and methods in real-world classrooms in the quote-unquote post-pandemic era? And by post-pandemic era, I mean after 2020. I was first inspired to write this paper when I saw Ariana Greenblatt's performance in part 5 of Ahsoka, Shadow Warrior. In this episode, we are brought directly back to the Clone Wars, but this time the medium is drastically different. What was once whimsical, colorful animation is dark, gritty, and three-dimensional live action. We are thrust into a hazy, smoky, deafening battle. Ahsoka has hardly any time to process where she is as Anakin calls for her and the clone troops to advance. It was here in this flashback that I realized just how young Ahsoka Tano truly was during the Clone Wars. She was not the adult that Rosario Dawson portrayed her to be. This was a child who was expected to lead ambushes and had to bear the burden of losing soldiers under her command. This was a visceral experience that the animated series had not done for me. As the battle resumes, the camera zooms in on Ahsoka's face as she watches Anakin Skywalker disappear in a haze of smoke, only to be replaced by Vader's silhouette. Her face is frozen in shock as the trauma of the Clone Wars crashes upon her all over again, facing a war that she should never have had to face, let alone be expected to command. In this clip, Ahsoka is hardly older than many of the students I've taught in my career, and it shook me to think that any of them would be able to command forces, let alone participate in a war. But then I realized that many of my students have done just that, most especially in the last 4 years as the COVID-19 pandemic emerged and impacted their lives forever. A recent study showed that more than 2/3 of children in the United States have or will experience trauma before the age of 16, and that this number is likely to increase because 140,000 children have lost a caregiver to COVID-19 or long-term COVID effects in recent years. While concepts of childhood trauma are not inherently new to educators, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed deep-seated systemic issues that showed us exactly how ill-equipped the United States is to deal with trauma, that our system needs a complete overhaul. Neuroscience has concluded that trauma, particularly childhood trauma, is dangerous to children and adolescents and drastically impacts their ability to learn. When children face trauma and conflict, they are in a constant state of stress, and the results directly impact their brains. This is especially dangerous for children and adolescents because their brains are still developing, and the elasticity of the brain leaves them especially vulnerable to permanent damage. When a person experiences a stressful or threatening situation, the brain triggers the release of stress hormones that heighten awareness and help prepare the body and brain to respond. We refer to this as our fight or flight response. But prolonged activation of the stress response leads to impairments in learning and memory, causing toxic stress. That is, stress that is chronic, uncontrollable, and unrelenting. According to Lohman and Gunnar, the impacts of toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences, or ACESs, are marked in early childhood when the brain is especially pliable. Toxic stress at this important developmental stage can lead the brain to over and under react to perceived threats, even small perceived threats. These lead to adverse behaviors, both at home and in the classroom. These effects can persist into adulthood if they're not addressed or if they are addressed poorly. Teachers across the country are seeing the consequences of the public schools' inefficient administration, policies, and curricula to help students cope with the trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see from this study, the survey in May of 2022, nearly 39% of all public school teachers who participated in this survey strongly agree that the COVID-19 pandemic negatively impacted the behavioral development of students at their school. Regardless of whether or not a child has lost a caregiver or a loved one to the illness, they still lost months, if not years, of social interactions, and at best spent most of their time in front of a computer screen and withdrawn from any social interaction or peer collaboration. Teachers have been and are leaving the profession in record numbers because they are simply burnt out from the lack of administrative support, fair wages, and actionable, equitable solutions from the government. Individual teachers care about their students, but when the institution is unsupportive, the individual eventually burns out. Our systems are not currently designed to help students with trauma because of the systemic issues of inequity throughout our society. Ahsoka's journey through her apprenticeship and the effects of institutional trauma begin at a very young age and continue through her education. Master Plo Koon sought out Ahsoka at the age of 3 and took her back to the Jedi Temple to receive training in the Jedi classroom. Separating Force-sensitive children from their families at such a young age was common practice for the Jedi, as they believed that familial and romantic attachments interfered with their abilities to focus on the Force. Neurologically, however, family separation causes severe and long-lasting harm and is considered an adverse childhood experience, or ACE, which leads to neurological damage. We see the results in our world when young children are separated from their families in the foster care system and as refugees make attempts to cross international borders and are met with armed guards. Though Ahsoka's separation from her family is framed as a positive experience in the show, we can already see the trauma that the educational institution is inflicting on Ahsoka and her fellow Padawan learners. Highly stressful experiences, like family separation, can cause irreparable harm, disrupting a child's brain architecture and affecting his or her short-term and long-term health. This is from the American Academy of Pediatrics. According to the Houston Chronicle, this kind of stress makes children susceptible to acute and chronic conditions, such as extreme anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, hypertension, and heart disease. Thankfully, Ahsoka's training in understanding the Force has given her ample opportunities to learn how to use the Force and the necessary calm needed to access it. Her time in the Jedi Temple, however she got there, has been a beneficial education for her. But the fact remains that she's still a child, and she has exceptional burdens to shoulder as her experiential education takes place throughout the Clone Wars. Students need to feel safe to make mistakes in the classroom. And if the environment consistently feels unsafe, then children are less likely to learn effectively. Though Ahsoka has the resources and access to meditative techniques and mindfulness practices, the Jedi Council keeps putting her on dangerous, high-stakes missions, and they expect her to be mature enough to hold a command. If a child makes a mistake in, say, a math classroom, the answer can be erased and corrected. But in the Clone Wars, troops died when Ahsoka made mistakes. As a teenager, Ahsoka's brain was still elastic, and research shows that the adolescent brain continues learning how to adapt to stress and trauma well into the young adult years. In the episode Storm over Ryloth, Ahsoka orders her troops to press forward in an attack, and many of her clone troops are killed. To be responsible for someone's death is a heavy burden for anyone, let alone a student. And yet this is a responsibility that the Jedi Masters have thrust upon her. But is this level of extreme and appropriate learning environment? Or is it done simply because the Clone Wars are necessary, according to the Jedi Council anyway? And what are the consequences of this on a child's developing brain? The Jedi Council further contributed to Ahsoka's trauma by turning her back on her when she was accused of treason and betrayed by her fellow Padawan, Barriss Offee. Instead of defending her, the Jedi Council withdrew and let the democratic process take place, thus leaving Ahsoka vulnerable. Here, the institution failed her and further compounded her trauma in much the same way as schools and institutions do in our own world. Alex Chevron-Venet highlights these issues in her book, Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education. Some examples of institutional trauma in our world include bullying, as perpetuated by peers, teachers, and administrators, harassment and homophobia, punitive, no tolerance, one size fits all policies, gun violence and physical violence, both in school and out of school, abuse, neglect, and poverty in the home, and another element that Chevron-Venet calls the deficit trap. This deficit trap refers to the idea, or I should say the mistaken idea, that kids are traumatized and therefore they can't be fixed. Once we fall into that deficit trap, and many schools and institutions have done so, that means, oh, well, we're not responsible for making sure that these kids are okay. And the other part of the deficit trap includes the idea that the system is so broken that we can't fix these kids. But kids are not machines to be fixed. Instead, what we need to fix are the systems. We need to fix injustice, and we need to ensure that systems are in place to help the kids learn and grow. We don't have a hammer. We don't have tools to, pop things back into place and boom, the kids are all right. Kids are elastic, kids are flexible. So we need systems to adapt to them and their needs. The Jedi Temple throughout was a source of institutional trauma for Ahsoka and many other Padawans, which led her to leave her apprenticeship with Anakin and make her own way in the Force. According to Chevron-Venet, educational equity ensures that all students can have access to high-quality education. And more importantly, there are systems in place to help students to do so. Chevron-Venet proposes that we as educators should reframe our understanding of trauma and trauma-informed practices as a collective responsibility and work to prevent trauma from occurring, rather than waiting for trauma to occur and applying the Band-Aid afterward. Once Ahsoka leaves the institution, the Jedi Temple, she has a better chance of understanding how the Force truly works and how she can contribute to a new path to Jedi enlightenment without adding additional institutional trauma. As a master to Sabine, Ahsoka is very reserved. As Huyang so blithely points out, Sabine's focus and abilities are trained entirely on her skills as a Mandalorian warrior. She's trained to trust these particular instincts, and she's not Force sensitive as past Padawans would have been. Ahsoka has the tools to teach Sabine, but she lacks the confidence to do so. She also struggles to adapt her instruction to Sabine's needs. She doesn't know how to help Sabine trust herself and access the Force. In much the same way, teachers today are given curricula in social emotional learning and mindfulness techniques in the hopes that these will fix problematic student behaviors and teach them to cope with their trauma. But these practices are mere band-aids that don't truly address the student's needs. Trauma-responsive education instead needs to be universal, proactive, and preventative. It needs to be anti-racist and anti-oppressive. In much the same way that Ahsoka and Sabine work together, Ahsoka knows how to apply a Band-Aid. Ahsoka knows how to teach Sabine how to fight using Jedi techniques. But what she doesn't know is how to adapt her instruction and meet Sabine as a Mandalorian warrior and access the Force in a different way. She only knows how to teach her how to do it the Jedi way. Ahsoka struggles to adapt her instruction because she hasn't confronted her own anxiety and trauma from the Clone Wars and the institutional trauma that taught her how to be a Jedi in the first place. And it's only until after her lesson with Anakin in the World Between Worlds that she learns how to let go of her trauma and choose to live. She lets go of the pressure of her apprenticeship with Anakin and the trauma that his turn to the dark side caused. When Anakin became Darth Vader, he shook Ahsoka's faith in herself. But in the world between worlds, Anakin helps Ahsoka see beyond the institution that failed her, and that although she is a part of that legacy, she is also her own Jedi, and that she can grow beyond the legacies of the Jedi Temple and of Darth Vader. Anakin, and therefore Ahsoka, revitalize the true nature of the master and apprentice relationship and the duality that Abdallah Rothman speaks to in Theology and the Star Wars Universe. According to Rothman, for Sankara and for much of Hinduism, the educational method itself comprises a spirituality within which the relationship between guru and disciple can be perfected and the disciple can achieve liberation. According to Rothman, liberation is the goal of self-growth and self-realization. This is characterized by the disciple freeing himself or herself from the psycho-spiritual limitations of identification with the ego self, thus stepping into or becoming the true or higher self. Ahsoka, as the apprentice, achieves the liberation that she had been seeking since Anakin's turn to the dark side, and thus can be a better master to Sabine. Throughout the Clone Wars and Ahsoka, we could see the institutional harm that the Jedi Council and the Galactic Republic created. But Ahsoka's abilities as a teacher show us that we can rework our systems to make our schools and our society equitable and truly trauma responsive. Our public school systems need to let go of the old ways of trauma-based pedagogy and revolutionize the way that we, as a society, approach trauma with equity and understanding. While perhaps we shouldn't go to the extreme of executing Order 66, we should work to provide resources, funding, and training to teachers and mental health experts to ensure that our little apprentices are safe and happy in their schools. Thank you all for listening. And if you have feedback for me, please be sure to write a comment, either in my Substack, YouTube channel, or on Spotify, wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've listened to this all the way through and you provide a comment with the code word Ahsoka, you can receive a free copy of my Hobbit activity pack. I've saved this note for the very end just to see if you've been paying attention. I know it's a true teacher move on my part. So remember, if you've listened to this podcast all the way through and you reply with a comment with the term Ahsoka, you can receive a free copy of my Hobbit activity pack. Thank you for your feedback. And of course, may the Force be with you and keep making magic. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your other favorite podcast feeds. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a rating and a review as well. You can read and find out more about Teaching with Magic by visiting our website, teachingwithmagic.blog. You can leave a message on our podcast page, read past Teaching with Magic posts, and check out our book lists on our affiliate page. We also invite you to support us on Patreon. You'll have access to bonus material, our Discord channel, live Q&As, and you'll get a sneak peek at future products such as lesson plans, worksheets, and other teaching tools. The link is always available in our show notes and the podcast page on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, keep making magic.